on Money Talk 1010 AM. It's the Morgan Streetman Show. Morgan and Roxanne Wilder are discussing everything from world, national, and local issues to information from the unknown. And since Morgan's an attorney, there'll probably be a little something from the law. Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Hey, Tampa Bay, we have got a great show for you today. We are so excited about our show today because we have a very special guest, and we're going to have him on for the entire hour because he's got a story to tell that is almost hard to believe. I mean, it's like Jason Bourne in real life.
What went into this is crazy.
It's unbelievable, folks. And so, without any further ado, let me introduce him. His name is Chris Kabatz. He is a national security consultant, and he's the vice president of a group called Understanding the Threat. Now, let me tell you a little about his background. He posed as a Muslim convert and then as an intern with the Hamas organization Council on American Islamic Relations. That's CARE. And he did that in Virginia in 2007. He was then invited by Hamas and CARE leaders to work at their headquarters office in Washington, D.C., and he's the entire story behind this thing that he did is laid out in the book called Muslim Mafia, which we have all at least leafed through because I got copies for Roxanne and Pat George here to look at.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I've read it previously many years ago when it came out. And it's also available right now today via the Understanding the Threat online store. Now, I've been saying that Chris is the vice president of Understanding the Threat, so let me tell you what Understanding the Threat is. Understanding the Threat is the only organization in the nation which provides a detailed assessment of the enemy threat in our local areas, providing law enforcement investigative solutions, and creating state-level counterinsurgency strategies to identify, dismantle, and defeat the jihadi network in our area. And that network is a lot more extensive than most of us realize.
So we're going to have to find out what UTT is doing here in the Tampa Bay area.
Absolutely. So with that, welcome to the show, Chris Kabatz.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear us, Chris? How are you?
Hi, how are you? I can hear you just fine.
Great. Welcome, Chris. I don't know if you heard that introduction, but I tried to give you a glowing one because you well deserve it.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Glad to be on today.
And it's a big treat for me to have you on because I've been following you for about 10 years since the book came out, and I was so impressed by what you did, and we don't want to tell the whole story just yet, but I wanted to draw folks' attention to something because I think they may remember this. The actual mosque that you had your conversion at, which I believe is owned by one of the Islamic groups, is it ISNA or NATE? One of those, and we'll get into what those mean, actually owns the mosque, but that particular mosque is the mosque where Anwar al-Awlaki was imam in the years of 2001 to 2002. Now, folks at home may remember that name, Anwar al-Awlaki, because he was the first U.S. citizen allegedly to ever be killed by drone strike. Remember, he was a radicalized imam in Virginia teaching people jihad and supporting al-Qaeda. He was making a lot of videos. I think at one point he was considered to be the bin Laden of the internet, they said, and basically was operating out of this mosque where you converted, Chris. Now, that to me is pretty, interesting piece of evidence, that's what's going on right here in the United States, that we have these mosques that are turning out this jihadi training. And we want to... Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I just wanted to say that's a great way to set the stage for that experience because you're right, that's the environment that I was going into. Not only is this a mosque that's owned by the North American Islamic Trust, Dar al-Hijra, which is a Muslim Brotherhood mosque, North American Islamic Trust is a Muslim Brotherhood organization, per the United States government and trials like the Holy Land Foundation trial. But you also had an imam that at the time was touted as the new moderate voice of Islam in America until, like you said, all of a sudden one day al-Awlaki pops up in Yemen as an al-Qaeda leader. That was that's a great way to paint the picture of what I was going into at Dar al-Hijra to convert, do a fake conversion into Islam for this project.
And, that raises an interesting point because, and I've seen you make this point before in talks that you've given, it's funny how these guys all get their version of Islam wrong in the same way. That,
Yeah.
they're moderate until all of a sudden they're radicals.
Yeah, absolutely. And we point to the broader picture of simply this. If you want to get down to the core of it, it is simply that whether it's Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, the Muslim Brotherhood, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, the Taliban, all these jihadi groups, like you said, they're saying the exact same thing, that they're waging jihad to establish an Islamic State under Sharia, and yet we're telling them that they don't understand Islam, even though from our experience, from a national security perspective, analyzing the writing of Al-Qaeda leaders and now the Islamic State and other jihadi groups, I'm hard-pressed to find an example where these guys have misquoted Islamic law in furtherance of what they're doing.
Right. And you know as well as I do, if you go and you look at the source documents and just listen to what these folks tell us, they'll tell us their entire plans and what they intend to do. And if you look at the Quran and the other Islamic laws, the Hadith and others, you'll find, like you say, they are applying Islam correctly. And that's the scary thing. It's actually the radicals who've got it right according to the documents.
Yeah, that's really where this becomes, once our leaders throughout the national security apparatus, and including and generals, once or if our leaders ever acknowledge that fact, that these guys are practicing core doctrinal Islam, that necessarily changes the nature of the war that we're in right now and the way that we fight it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we've seen throughout this last, 17 years or so that they've gotten it wrong over and over and over again. They've listened to the wrong people. In fact, they've listened to terrorists and terrorist sympathizers for an explanation of how they should think about Islam. And we know, because we study this, that folks can, Muslims can lie to non-Muslims for what they consider to be a cause for good, that's not actually a sin or anything that's wrong. In fact, it's looked upon as something good. And of course, to them, a cause for good would be to spread Allah's law throughout the land. And we can get this all from, and I love y'all's website, understandingthethreat.com. And I just want to say, I just bought the 2 DVDs y'all have, and those are fascinating. The first DVD is a great overview, and folks, we only have an hour here, and part of this, I really want to get into Chris's story directly. But if you want to really, if you're saying, gosh, I'm having a hard time swallowing this idea, then you need to get some information that will help you to see. These are source documents. This is facts. And that's what's presented in the videos. The second video I found just absolutely fascinating, though, because of the protest, the little miniature protest that was occurring, and apparently that video was filmed in the fall of last year. So it doesn't seem like we're making the kind of progress that we should be in terms of folks getting a true understanding of this. And, if you go on that Understanding the Threat website, folks, you'll find the bylaws of the International Muslim Brotherhood, which they've now taken off of their English language website. But the bylaws very clearly tell you that their goal is to establish Allah's law in the land. Now, that goal means Sharia, and we've covered on this show extensively what Sharia means. They also want to establish an Islamic State. Does that sound familiar to anyone, the Islamic State? And they talk about how the Islamic nation has to be fully prepared to fight the tyrants and the enemies of Allah as a prelude to establishing an Islamic State. So their own bylaws talk about establishing Sharia through violent jihad. Then we've got this memorandum that was found in Virginia in 2004, in Annandale, Virginia, in a raid, which is a 5-phase plan, which is called the Phases of World Underground Movement Plan. That's a Muslim Brotherhood document that was found in their archives that were in this home in Virginia. And it goes through the phases, to how they want to basically try to overthrow America. And, it talks about how they rely on secrecy and basically disinformation and lying to us in order to accomplish this plan. Because if we knew the truth about what they were trying to do, we might try to stop them. One last thing I wanted to say, it's just a font of information there on the website, is there's a report that came out from the Muslim Brotherhood in 1991, and within that report, it said specifically, and I want folks to hear this because it's just unbelievable, is that they were, well, I'm trying to flip to the page here. Hold on. Got it. The process of settlement, which is what they talk about, is a civilization jihadist process with all that word means. And it talks about basically that they're going to move in here, expand their operations, and take over. And we've seen them doing that. So when we come back after the break, we're going to let Chris take the reins here, and he's going to tell us all about how he infiltrated this mosque in Virginia and what he found when he went looking around in there. It's fascinating stuff, folks, and he's one of the people who's done it. He's been there. He knows what's on the inside of these Muslim Brotherhood organizations. We'll come right back on the Morgan Streetman Show.
We're back on the Morgan Streetman Show. Roxanne Wilder with you, Morgan Streetman as always, and Pat George. And we have a very special guest on the phone with us. Chris Gabatz is the author of Muslim Mafia, and he's telling the story as to how he infiltrated CARE and all of his findings. And so, Chris, we want to talk to you about your background a little bit before you did this. Before you did your false conversion and infiltration, you were with several Fortune 500 companies. You did fraud investigations and asset protection. So kind of an definitely an investigative background beforehand, because someone may say, well, how do you get into this line of work?
Yeah, I will tell you, I'm the last person that you would ever consider that would be doing undercover research inside of a jihadi mosque here in the United States. I would not be in this work if it wasn't for my father. My father was a career Air Force man. He was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and towards the end of his career, he worked counterintelligence for the Air Force. And in layman's terms, he was a spy catcher. But after he retired in the late 90s, he was done. He had put together a 20-year career, several awards, honors, commendations throughout his career. 9/11 occurred, and at that time, I was involved in fraud investigations, particularly check and credit card fraud investigations. My father answered the call of the government to go back in to serve, and so he went to become a State Department trained Arabic linguist and went over into Iraq in 2003 and 2004. And was over there before the war started in Iraq, and during the war was collecting intelligence on the ground in very, very dangerous work. And when he came back from that in 2004 and in 2005, he started to ask some basic questions. Mm-hmm. Was what I was seeing over in Iraq with these jihadi groups, how is that drastically different than what's being taught here in the mosques in the United States? And he, being a good investigator, does what any good investigator does. They go straight to the source. Mm-hmm. And he started to go into these mosques and ask questions. And throughout that process, in 2007 rolls around, and he asked me to help him on a project because he just needed someone he could trust. He was no longer in a federal agent. He was a civilian at that point. And so he just needed someone he could trust on this project he was working on to show what the Muslim Brotherhood is like behind closed doors. And so he asked me, and the rest is history, as they say. I ended up going into those mosques and ended up working with CARE, which is Hamas here in the United States. And the book Muslim Mafia came out in 2009 detailing that experience.
Now, Chris, let me ask you, do you speak Arabic or can you read it?
No, I've been studying Islam for the last 10 years, and I love to dispel this myth. One of the myths that particularly to what we call suit-wearing jihadis will say is that you can't understand Islam if you don't speak Arabic. Right. And that's just patently false. They put out enough information, they, meaning Islamic scholars, that has already been translated into English. So do I know enough to get around the mosque and know the basic phrases that are said repeatedly over and over? Yes. Do I speak conversational Arabic? Absolutely not. you really don't need to understand this thread. And that's one of the narratives that has kept our leaders from taking a deep dive into this issue, because they've been told by their Islamic advisors that they can't possibly understand this if they don't speak Arabic. So they need to rely on their Islamic advisors to tell them about our enemy, and that is a recipe for disaster.
Well, and that reminds me of a video I think I've seen where there's some guy, and he's some imam, and he's talking about we're all supporters of Hamas here. And everybody's cheering that, and then I think they called him and they said, I mean, you obviously know the story. You tell it better than me. Go, Chris.
I know the one you're talking about. That's Abdurrahman Al-Amoudi. Yeah, he's outside. He's in Washington, D.C., and he's yelling, "I'm a supporter of Hamas. Anybody here a supporter of Hamas?" And the whole crowd goes wild. And then "I'm a supporter of Hezbollah. Anybody here a supporter of Hezbollah?" And the whole crowd goes wild. A reporter calls him and asks, "Hey, I got this video here of you supporting Hamas." He's like, "Oh, you better check your Arabic." And he's like, the reporter's like, "Well, but you said it in English," and then he hangs up the phone.
So we know this is a defense that they use every single time. It's just like boilerplate that they throw up. That if you don't speak Arabic or you don't understand Arabic, you can't possibly deal with us. And we've seen that they're making efforts to move English language information off of their site so that we can't now even get on and find this. But tell us a little bit about, because we want to hear this story about, what you actually did. I mean, did you just start showing up at the mosque, and then how did that go? How did you actually go through a false conversion that apparently CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood believed was a real conversion?
Well, so I went straight into Dar al-Hijra, and actually went in with my father, and we just told the imam that I was interested in converting to Islam, and spent a few weeks at the mosque, going in almost every day. And if I wasn't going into the mosque, I was meeting with people that attended the mosque, and essentially this became my way of learning how to become a Sharia adherent Muslim, so that eventually when I showed up to CARE's offices in their now defunct CARE Maryland, Virginia office in Grove Street, or in Herndon, Virginia, which is in Northern Virginia, right outside the Beltway. I needed to, for part of the project, I needed to come off as a Muslim that already understood the program, that was already on board with what CARE was doing. And so by spending time at this mosque, learning how to pray, learning how to eat, learning how to interact with Muslims, male and female, in a Sharia adherent manner from actual Muslim brothers. The imam that walked me through my conversion was Sheikh Shaker El-Said. This is the guy that was the executive director with the Muslim American Society, which is the overt arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, meaning they're not even trying to hide it.
Right.
So I learned from them how to be a Sharia adherent Muslim, and that time period ended up being invaluable, because when I showed up at CARE's offices, they already assumed I understood Islam, jihad, Sharia, because I was putting myself off as a Sharia adherent Muslim, and much of what I learned at Dar al-Hijra helped me to do that later on in the project. Well,
you really, you kind of played right into their strategy, which is to try to convert probably new Muslims here in America, and you were going to be the poster boy, I'm sure, for that, they thought.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, here's the thing. The Muslim Brotherhood has so infiltrated our government that they fully understand that, with very few exceptions, federal agents are not sending people into mosques undercover, right? They are so terrified of the implications of that because of their Islamic advisors have told them that it would be offensive to Muslims.
Right.
It would be offensive to jihadis, which is exactly why we should be doing it. But so they're not expecting this, is what I'm saying. And so from that perspective, having my father, who had worked not only counterintelligence operations, but also just basic narcotics operations undercover at the Air Force, we knew fully well how to do this legally and how to go in there. But that is one of their Achilles heels, is they're not expecting it, because with very few exceptions, it's just not happening at the federal level, and I would even argue at the state or local level. And so, played right into their playbook. They want to get American converts to then work apologetics for them on television and with national and local media. That's part of what they call, when you are reading the document from the explanatory memorandum, civilization jihad by our hands. That's part of the strategy.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what's one of the most interesting things you learned about what it means to be Sharia adherent?
Sure. So from a national security perspective, that's our delineating factor. We understand that not every person that self-identifies as a Muslim is a threat. What we do acknowledge, though, is that if they are adhering to Sharia, and the more that they adhere to Sharia, then necessarily the higher likelihood that they are of being a threat here in the United States. So Sharia adherence, there's a book called Milestones by Saeed Qutb that best way to put it, operationalizes Islamic law for the modern jihadi. Mm-hmm. And he talks about at an individual level and a societal level of understanding that you don't just change a society drastically or an individual drastically overnight. You have to do it progressively and in stages. And so Sharia adherence can actually be observed scientifically based on how a certain person prays, the type of phrases that they say, how far along are they on their understanding of Islam, the way they dress. Those can all be factors, and there's a fascinating website. We don't have time to go into it. But
right, Chris, let me have you hold right now. We're going to come right back after this hard break, and we'll get back to that website on the Morgan Streetman Show.
Sounds good.
And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. We've got a very special show for you today. We're welcoming a special guest, Chris Kravets, to the show today, who's got an amazing background. And some of the things he's been telling us about is the civilization jihad that the Muslim Brotherhood is conducting. And, of course, all of their documents establish that this is exactly what they intend to do and is what they are doing. And it involves a lot of different organizations. In fact, they've been forming a couple of hundred organizations a year over the past couple of decades. And they all seem to have these benign names like the Islamic Society of North America, the Muslim Students Association, which was actually their original foray into creating these organizations back in the early 60s. We've got the North American Islamic Trust. We've heard Chris talk about that. That's called NATE. The Muslim Businessmen Association, Muslim Youth of North America, Islamic Association for Palestine, Islamic Circle of North America, and so on and so forth. And I mean, there are literally hundreds of these organizations that they're using to conduct this civilization jihad against us. And what Chris Kravets did was he infiltrated the CARE office in Virginia and basically went undercover and discovered all kinds of interesting stuff while he was there. So he was just telling us about Sharia adherence and a website. And Chris, I'm going to let you take back over and pick back up where you were with that.
Sure. So the point I want to make is that you can actually document or Sharia adherence, observe it from a scientific basis. And there's a website called mappingsharia.com. And it was a project where a sample of 100 random mosques around the country had people go in and observe the physical the observable Sharia adherence, and what that document, which is a peer-reviewed study, showed there's a 1-to-1 correlation between visible Sharia adherence and the promotion of either moderate or overt violent jihadi doctrine. And so I encourage people to go to that mappingsharia.com. And one of the things, before I even go any further, I always like to tell people this. I encourage people, if this is something that's a new topic for you, a lot of what we're talking about here can be a lot and can even be overwhelming. What we encourage you to do is not just regurgitate what we're saying, but actually challenge us and go and review the information we have on our website, understandingthethreat.com. And we always put a challenge out. If there's anything that we say about Islam, jihad, or Sharia, or the jihadi network here in the United States that is untrue, not only will we pull it out from our briefings and our training to law enforcement, but we will also give the person that brings that to our attention $1,000. And since we've been making that offer, we have not lost a penny. So
I was going to say,
we're more than happy to do that.
How many takers have you gotten on that one?
Not even one.
Yeah, and you guys have never been sued for defamation or anything like that either, have you?
No, I'm in a lawsuit right now because of the book Muslim Mafia that was released in 2009, completely separate from understanding the threat and what we do.
Right.
Yeah, as what we do is unimpeachable because law enforcement, they understand facts and evidence. In our training programs, what we do is outline facts and evidence from terrorism trials here in the United States. And our source material that we train from is source material that Islamic scholars use here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so I often, I just have to, as serious as this topic is, I just have to laugh sometimes because we're called Islamophobes and haters and bigots, and yet I'm using materials that are in mosques all over the United States to train from. So I think that they're calling the wrong people Islamophobic. They should be calling the imams Islamophobic because they're the ones that have recommended the material that I train out of.
Well, it's such a complicated issue because you're right. I mean, when you've got an opponent who's willing to be deceptive in a lot of different ways, it becomes very hard to kind of deal with them on an intellectual level. And I think that's part of what we're dealing with here, because it almost reminds me of Marxist-Leninist type of writing that they've got where they redefine words. To them, words like settlement don't mean what we think they might mean, and they basically take a lot of words and redefine them, at least in my impression. And that makes it very hard to necessarily for a layperson to be able to pick apart and understand what they're really saying.
That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. If the listeners get anything from this hour, and I hope they get several nuggets out of this hour, but one of the big ones is simply this. From an Islamic law perspective, from a Sharia perspective, jihad is total warfare. We seem to think here in the United States, when we think about jihad, we think about, the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda shooting things and blowing things up. That's one aspect of jihad. Jihad is total warfare. So it's intelligence gathering. It's counterintelligence, espionage, treason, subversion. It is propaganda, media manipulation, even interfaith dialogue, where you're working with pastors, priests, and rabbis to end up defending the local Islamic community. All of these are part of the jihad, and so different organizations here in America, which primarily the Muslim Brotherhood is driving the jihad here in the United States, understand that when they have a Congressional Muslim Staffers Association, where they work to place interns, Muslim Brotherhood sympathetic or actual Muslim Brotherhood interns into congressional staffers' offices on Capitol Hill. That's part of the jihad. When they work with journalists, so that anytime there's an issue that comes up related to Islam, jihad, or Sharia, that journalist contacts CARE, then that's part of the jihad because CARE gets to drive the narrative. When they work with pastors, when they work with law enforcement on diversity and sensitivity training, that's part of the jihad. Jihad for them is total warfare. Physical violence and terrorism is just one aspect of that warfare. And once you understand that, it really does put into perspective these different jihadi groups that we brought up today, the North American Islamic Trust, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, IGNA, the Islamic Circle of North America. These are all jihadi organizations that play different roles, but the end goal is always the same, and this is where they share. I testified in front of the U.S. Senate last summer, and I made this comment, that this statement, this is where they all share the same ideology, whether it's the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, or the Muslim Brotherhood. They all have the same goal, which is to establish an Islamic State under Sharia, and all of these organizations are working towards that end. And they understand that it's not going to be tomorrow or next year or even the year after to where they establish an Islamic State here in the United States. In the meantime, they are able to affect our foreign policy, and they are able to gather intelligence on us elsewhere in the meantime while they're working towards that goal.
Right.
And one more point that
go
you
ahead.
brought up is just that I love the way you put that. You're right. Whether it's this Marxist ideology or the jihadi ideology, changing words in the narrative. This is a war of narratives. One narrative says that these problems that we're facing with terrorism and cultural jihad, that has nothing to do with Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other narrative is reality.
Right.
And what we're trying to do with understanding the threat is push the truth and the reality narrative out there, which is why groups like CARE want to shut us down everywhere we speak and everywhere we do training.
Chris, you brought up law enforcement a moment ago, and one of the interesting things that I read in your book is about CARE's law enforcement guide. And it's just fascinating to me that this law enforcement guide that they provided really is completely opposite of what law enforcement is allowed to do and needs to do in order to deal with investigations or deal with criminals. Things like don't demand eye contact and it's how is it that a religious group cannot those laws aren't, or those rules and procedures aren't allowed to be performed on them?
That is part of the jihad. That's a great point. Look, when you can keep law enforcement on their heels to where they are so worried, and their public affairs offices are so worried about doing anything related to the mosque or an imam or the Islamic community, that they would just assume leave it alone because they know that CARE and these other suit-wearing jihadi groups are going to crash down with their legal team and try to make it so uncomfortable for law enforcement to do their job. They put them on their heels, and which is why that you've got known mosques that we could show an affidavit right now, a certain Muslim Brotherhood mosque that necessarily, based on their Sharia adherence, are committing crimes, and yet when law enforcement doesn't understand that, and even if they do, they're not equipped to go in and actually make these arrests because they don't have the training and they don't have the backing of their public affairs officers and other parts of the department. And CARE understands that. I guess that's the biggest point I really want to make today is this war is much bigger than just shooting things and blowing things up. All of this plays into the war for them, and CARE understands that perfectly, and other Muslim Brotherhood groups understand that perfectly.
Yeah, it's really a war for the mind. It's an information war, and they're they appear to be winning because they're outmaneuvering those of us that recognize what reality is, or at least that's the appearance of it, because they've gotten so many folks into these different positions of power in government and civic life and business and other places that they've been able to affect a significant portion of their plan before we've really become fully aware of it and start responding appropriately.
Oh, absolutely. They know they're winning the narrative war. You just take an example of right now we have Understanding the Threats president, John Guandolo, is a U.S. Naval Academy graduate who is scheduled to speak next week at the U.S. Navy Academy's Alumni Association in San Diego. Mm-hmm. And CARE is working diligently to have them shut that venue down. That's what they do. They shut down anyone that speaks truthfully about this threat. And you all know this, from what you're doing. You're bold enough and courageous enough to speak about this issue, but in the media, generally, people shy away from this topic unless it's those that are complicit with Muslim Brotherhood groups who will glow and call them civil rights organizations. So for people understand how uncomfortable it is to speak about this issue, which is why so many leaders just shy away from it because they don't want to deal with the hassle.
Yeah, and We're about to go into a hard break, and when we come back, I'm going to want you to tell us some about how we can get more educated and more involved in trying to resist this. But before we get to that break, I just wanted to read to folks something. This comes right out of the Muslim Brotherhood's own materials. It says, "The Brotherhood must understand that their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their own hands." We'll be right back on the Morgan Streetman Show.
Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show, an exciting hour with our special guest, Chris Gebetz. He's the author of Muslim Mafia. And Chris, I want to find out if you've had your life threatened in any way because of the work that you've done.
Oh, you know what? There's always a threat with this right now, we at Understanding the Threat are not going to be deterred whatsoever by that. But yeah, that's absolutely what we're doing is breaking the Islamic law of slander and blasphemy laws, and it's very clear in Islamic law what that penalty is, which is death. And so any jihadi would be in their right to kill any of us that are involved in this. And that's where we put our faith in God, and we know that we're doing the right thing, even though it may not necessarily be the safest thing. At this point, we're gonna do what's right, regardless of the consequences.
And we've talked throughout the show about UTT, but let's let our listeners know a little bit what it's all about, and if there's work being done here in the Tampa Bay area in regards to UTT. Understanding the Threat, we have a representative in Florida, Billy Vaughn, Gold Star father. He's a good man. We're blessed to have him on our team. And if anyone wants to bring Understanding the Threat to your area and do training for citizens or law enforcement, contact us on our website, understandingthethreat.com, and ask that Billy or somebody from our Florida team reach out to you, and we'll be glad to do that. And absolutely, Florida is a place that there's a lot of activity out there,
right?
And citizens need to be aware of this.
Right. Now, some of the things that you can find on the Understanding the Threat website, like we've talked about, is some of these documents that we've quoted from. Those are all under the Research and Resources tab. But you've also got some great videos. And Chris, tell us about, I think you've just started a few weeks ago, maybe about a month ago, a television show.
Yeah, on Worldview Weekend. That's if you just Google Worldview Weekend and Understanding the Threat. We actually have a television show and we have a weekly radio show. And we detail the Muslim Brotherhood Network in the United States on the TV show, and then weekly on the radio show, we give people an overview of what's going on and also practical steps that they can take. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a war of narratives. So we always get asked questions by citizens, what can we do? We're not law enforcement, we're not sheriffs, we're not legislators. What can we do? So what you can do is reach out to your pastor or priest or rabbi and give them a copy of our book, Raising a Jihadi Generation. It's a synopsis of the threat here in the United States. And we'll come out and speak to your church. We don't charge any speaking fee. That's how important we feel that pastors are in this war. And sheriffs are the most powerful law enforcement officer in the nation. So if you have any relationship with a sheriff or a deputy within a sheriff's department, get them a copy of Raising a Jihadi Generation and start the conversation of having us come out and train their department. We would be glad to do that. That's going to be the future of this war. We're going to root this out county by county, state by state. And pastors and sheriffs are the two most important people groups in this war right now. And citizens that have a relationship with those groups, put us in touch, and you can start that conversation, and then we'll certainly come in and fill them in on what's going on.
Now, tell us a little bit about that event you did in September of last year, and I think it was in Iowa, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, so we are really proud of this DVD. I think this was a great example of what we call the red-green axis, where you've got the hard left Marxist socialist movement working hand in hand with the jihadi movement, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood here. And so we're speaking in Iowa, and we had protesters that were sitting in the front of our venue holding up newspapers so that the people behind them couldn't see us, and then you also had them wearing headphones so that they didn't even want to listen to the message. What I think is they're sort of illustrating our point is that people here don't want to hear this, particularly on the left, and to the point that they'll put earphones in so that they don't hear the truth. That is a great DVD. That's our 2-hour. It's about an hour and a half presentation that we did in Iowa. And for people to get a feel of, if you want to have us come out and speak in your community, watch that DVD. That you'll get a feel of the type of program that we do. No two programs are ever the same, but generally that's about the topics that we would be hitting on.
Mm-hmm. And do you have anything else that you're working on right now other than understanding the threat, or is that really what you're spending all of your energy on now?
Yeah, right now, I'm the Vice President of Understanding the Threat, and I got to tell you, keeping up with the jihadi movement here in the United States is a 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week job. Mm-hmm. We have a campaign for those people that are listening. If you want to help us, I encourage you to go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. If this is a war of narratives, one of the biggest things you can help us do is share our message on Twitter and on Facebook, because this is a war of narratives, and we need as many people out there helping us get our narrative out, the truthful narrative, and getting on social media right now is a great way to help us do that.
And what is the Twitter handles that they should be looking for to follow?
UTT_USA. And then if you go to that Twitter handle, my Twitter handle and John Guandola's Twitter handle is on that page. And all three of us, if you could help us spread that message, it really does make a difference. We all know President Trump pays attention to Twitter. And so anytime you can share our message and CC President Trump on it, it never hurts. And it's also helping the people that follow you see our message so that more people understand what's going on.
Yeah, and there's so much more to this story because we just were barely able today just to scratch the surface. I mean, some of the stuff that you found out when you infiltrated that CARE office in Virginia that they were doing to Muslims, which was basically defrauding them. I mean, it is like a story on its own. And
it really is, yeah.
And there's so much more that we could get to.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, too, that struck me, again, we won't have time to talk about it in great length, but just the sort of discrimination that takes place within organizations like CARE against people who don't follow the specific, whether it's a different type of Muslim, right?
Yeah. Well, and go ahead, Chris.
Well, they build themselves as a civil rights organization, and they're simply not. And that example of where CARE was defrauding Muslims that wanted help with their immigration cases is a perfect example of the fact that CARE doesn't really care about civil rights only when certain civil rights cases help their agenda. And you can read about that in Muslim Mafia. We have that in our store at understandingthethreat.com. And I would be glad to come on again because this hour just flew by.
Didn't it, though?
Just go through.
Well, you know what, Chris? You're thinking right along the lines that we are, because we were going to ask you if you'll just hang on the line. We'd love to talk with you a little bit more after the show is over and maybe set up another time for you to come on, or maybe even do a lengthier podcast with us where we won't even have any commercials and we can really get into some of the meat of the story. Thank you so much, though, for coming on. I mean, it was fantastic. Such a treat for me personally. I'm honored that you would come on the show. And just really have a lot of respect for what you've done. And it's fascinating, and I'm glad we were able to share some of the story with the folks at home. So, folks, we'll see you next week. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it.